Okay, well, welcome folks to Thistle Anderson, a lady writer, a little red book and a city in uproar. My name is Isabel Story and I'm your presenter for today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various parts of South Australia and to pay our respect to their elders, past and present. And we also extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from beyond South Australia who may be visiting, living or working in this state. And while we're on acknowledgements, I would also like to acknowledge Mr. Michael Stewart, who lives in Canterbury, UK, and who very generously shared a lot of his family research with me some 8 or 9 years ago. It tallied with mine, but he filled in a lot of gaps and I'm extremely grateful. He was very, very generous. So thank you, Mr. Michael Stewart. Okay, so this is Thistle Anderson. Born in Scotland, she came from a very respectable upper class family, really upper middle class, and she came to Australia when she was 7 years old. Her father, George, had been appointed Deputy Master of the Melbourne Mint, an official title. He actually was the boss, the Governor of the Mint. After her father's death, she left her Melbourne home in her late teens to work for the firm. That was the general name for J.C. Williamson's theatre company, and that was in Melbourne. She was 6 feet tall, according to her early publicity, very blonde and very buxom, and she worked for Williamson's as part of the chorus and in minor touring roles, although she aspired to much greater things. So today I'm going to explore some of Thistle's lesser known, indeed almost unknown history, and let's start here with her heritage. So that's hard to read. I'll give you an enlargement in a moment, but it's copied from the 1881 United Kingdom census in the parliamentary borough of Chelsea. It's a list of the inhabitants of 5 households in Sumner Place. Number 10, that's in Kensington. Number 10 is the Anderson household. At this time, 1881, it contains George Anderson, who is 61 years old, his wife Mary, who is 28 years old. She's generally known as Polly, and a 2-year-old girl, Mary C. Anderson. The other 2 residents are a nursemaid, Margaret, and a coachman, Benjamin. But it's little Mary C. Anderson, born in Glasgow on the 12th of October 1878, that we're concerned with today. The C stood for Clavering, which was her mother's maiden name. So Mary Clavering Anderson later came to be known as Thistle Anderson. This may have been because she was Scottish, or perhaps she could be prickly and quite tenacious, as some of Adelaide's residents learned a few years later the hard way. Thistle also was quite rebellious when young, and when they came to Australia, her father, or possibly Polly, we're not sure which parent, but anyway, she was sent, although they were Presbyterian, she was sent to a Catholic convent school. That may have helped shape some of her later behaviour, we're not sure. Sorry, I'll just go on with that one. So that's just a slight enlargement of that family reference. And this is her father, George Anderson. He was a British politician, educated at Edinburgh and St Andrews Universities. He was a major in the 4th Lanark Rifles, a mining shareholder, and elected member of the House of Commons for Glasgow for 17 years. In mid-1885, George came to Australia with Polly and then 2 children. So there was Mary, who was nearly 7, and a baby, George, her younger brother. So George Anderson Sr. had been employed as Deputy Minister of the Melbourne Mint, as I said. After his retirement, he published a volume of poems which was well reviewed in several Australian journals, including the Australasian. George died in Melbourne of a heart attack in November 1896, some 11 years after their arrival, and he was buried in the Presbyterian section of the Burundara Cemetery. no gravestone, interestingly. He was survived by his wife, Polly, and Mary Clavering Anderson, just 18, and his son George, who was then 11. Now, back to Thistle. This is a report from Melbourne publication Table Talk. Now, the socials in those days, as now I suppose, thrived on society gossip, and gossip about this particular wayward daughter of the upper classes of Melbourne was a regular occurrence. I suspect she actually fed much of it to the papers herself. However, there is one story from 1898 which was a very closely kept secret that the gossip columnists didn't know about, and it's just as well. You'll hear about it at the very end of today's presentation. This is what you're looking at now, a theatre review from Table Talk in Melbourne. Here Thistle is described as one of the prettiest girls in Australia. Thistle would have loved that. And it announces that she has crossed the Rubicon, no turning back. She's gone on the stage. And it describes her debut appearance in Zenda. Here she plays the wife of the Sultan, whom she eclipses as she stands next to him. This isn't difficult because he's 2 feet shorter. And it goes, the reviewer says, a corner of the Sultan's helmet unobtrusively appears somewhere in the region of his wife's waist. That is all, and one longs in vain for a glimpse of the Sultan's bronzed visage or even a suggestion of the legs and feet, but these are lost behind clouds of pink and white silk, and the Sultan's gorgeous uniform is left to the imagination. So Thistle continued to perform with the firm, and she appears in Babes in the Wood in January 1898, following year, and also in court, that is, a law court. It seems that Thistle had encouraged a woman called Janet Priest, a servant or a guest, it's hard to tell, to sue a widow, Mrs. Polly Anderson, for 4 years' worth of unpaid wages amounting to £58 and 10 shillings. Now, Thistle loathed Polly Anderson. She referred to her as Polly. She never spoke of her as mother. And there was also the small matter of some family jewellery, which Thistle wanted, particularly a ring, and Polly wouldn't hand it over. So that led to this court case in which Thistle had encouraged Janet to sue and told her that she would back her up. And that was pending on her mother's jewellery, although she said later in court that wasn't true. As you get to know Thistle, you kind of get an idea that it probably was true and that she was blackmailing her mother, but Polly didn't give in and the jewellery wasn't forthcoming. Meanwhile, beyond the theatre, another form of entertainment was growing and growing. In the late 1890s, Mac Robertson, of Cherry Ripe fame, same one, set up a cycling school in his confectionery factory in Melbourne. Now, this was to complement his bicycle import business. Mac Robertson heavily advertised the Sunbeam Bicycle Social. That's a bicycle where two, as you can see there, two cyclists could ride sitting next to each other, and Mac Robertson encouraged their use for wedding parties. So he was very keen on novelty cycling, such as musical quadrilles. And on the right there, you'll see an image, that one, of a former British cavalry officer, Professor, that was the term in those days, he wasn't a university professor, Professor Charles Herbert Eckenstein. And Eckenstein's job was to teach riding skills and to prepare groups for public displays. Bert Eckenstein, as you'll see from the photograph, was considered very dashing, very handsome, and he soon became very popular, particularly with the ladies. He was Bert to his friends, and Thistle appears to have become a very, very close friend, although there does remain some mystery around this. So Bert had been a cavalry officer in England, but after he'd been kicked in the head by a horse, his constant headaches and mood swings put an end to his military career. So his parents brought him back to Australia, where his brother, William, had already settled. So here, Professor Eckenstein made a new start with trick cycling and teaching, and he was very good at it. But unfortunately, things went very badly wrong for Bert. He suicided. Shortly before his death, Bert had been involved in a sordid Melbourne court case which involved a theft and prostitution. A barmaid who also seemed to be working as a prostitute, which wasn't uncommon in pubs in those days, barmaid had been hired by Eckenstein, apparently. He accompanied her upstairs and later claimed she had stolen some gold jewellery from him. And because he made a big deal about it and went to the police, he appeared in court. Now remember, he's working for McRobertson. McRobertson is a really pious Scot. So Bert is terrified, and he appears as witness number 1, and his mate is witness number 2. His mate was with him at the pub, in order to protect his identity. But it was pointless because he was so well known in Melbourne that most people knew who he was the second he stepped into court. He was so terrified that McRobertson would find out and fire him that he sank into a depression. Remember, he also had this neurological thing from being kicked in the head. And he'd never quite gotten over that. He was also supposed to be heavily in debt, and certainly was suffering from some kind of depression. There's a bit more to it than that. But anyway, in January 1897, Bert shot himself in the head, and the newspapers, particularly in Melbourne, had a field day. It was front page news everywhere. So enter Thistle. Okay. At least in early March 1897, so a couple of months after his death, she was working in chorus for J.C. Williamson's. And a few weeks after his suicide, this is 1887, she changed her stage name from Thistle Anderson to Thistle Eckenstein. And she kept what she called her nom de stage, for a little over a year. However, she denied in the social pages that she had married Bert secretly shortly before his death. And she then places 2 in memoriam notices, one in 87, and a year later when she's in Sydney, she inserts another one, that's the one at the bottom, in memoriam of my dear friend Bert Eckenstein, who died in Melbourne, 14th of January 1907, inserted by Thistle Anderson. Now, she is very particular about inserting her name. She does that on the Melbourne advert and a year later on the Sydney one, so she's right up there. But she's completely denying that she married him. It's very peculiar. So Thistle then travelled with Williamson's. She settled in Sydney for a while, had several very well publicised romantic affairs and broken engagements, including with minor royalty, we don't know who, and with a visiting black American singer, which in those days was huge. I mean, for her, he was from America, brought his all black troupe with him. It wasn't blackface. And she got engaged to him and went into the papers as an engagement notice. And then it just fizzled. No one knows what happened. So anyway, by the way, that time in Sydney in 1898 is very important to the story and the secret I referred to earlier. So she visited Adelaide on tour with Fedora, and in mid-1901 went off to London with Williamson's. On the left there is Nance O'Neill, next to, on the right, a publicity photograph of Thistle, who was often likened to her in appearance, although she never came anywhere near achieving Nance O'Neill's fame as an actress, or indeed her later notoriety. That's Nance, not Thistle. Nance became the lover of the alleged axe murderess Lizzie Borden, which caused Lizzie Borden's sister to move out of their house, where they'd moved after Lizzie had knocked off her father and stepmother with an axe, but it was never proven. Anyway, that's another story for another time. So this is a fairly recent, you'll see by the cars, recent image of Holy Trinity Church in Brompton in England, London. So it was here on December 16th, 1901, that Thistle married the former Adelaide stockbroker Herbert Fisher from Adelaide. Now, he'd arrived in London a few months previously, around about June, July, and they married in December. We don't know whether Herbert met her Thistle in Australia, maybe on that trip that she came to Adelaide with the company, or he may have travelled to Melbourne or Sydney and seen her on stage, met her. I don't know. No one knows. So this is one of the South Australian wedding reports from the Adelaide Critics Society pages. That was then the province of Lady Kitty. Note the phrase walked on in several plays. Now that's an insult. She's saying, oh, she just said walk on part, which was true for the most part. But anyway, we'll get to Lady Kitty a bit later. So here she is. This is Mrs. Herbert Fisher at the races in Adelaide in 1903. They came back a couple of years after their marriage, and she, Thistle, is the very tall, statuesque lady in the black hat. And the environment and her dress show that she was very much, at that time, part of Adelaide society, or at least she attended many of the right events. And this is what caused the problem. This is the cover of Arcadian Adelaide. It was produced in 1905. This, I think, is its 9th reprint, and I believe it went to 19. The first edition cover was green, as I remember, not red. Anyway, it was a little pamphlet of about 40 pages, self-published under Thistle's maiden name, with her married name, Mrs. Herbert Fisher, below in brackets. Just by the way, how many of you have read or come across? Only, oh, really? But you don't count Mark because you pinched my copy from my desk. So Mark is my boss. He's unobtrusively. Okay, so the publication of this book basically caused either gales of laughter or fainting fits and conniptions, and not just within the upper crust, which was mostly what Thistle was taking aim at, but she certainly got a reaction. I mean, 19 reprints is pretty good. Some thought the little book was shocking, but somewhat wonderful in its daring. Now, that's Millie from the quiz, who was a friend, so that's a favourable review. These are just a sample that I'm going to show you of the numerous critiques, and it was published across Australia. The critiques appeared in everything, including a scathing one in the Bulletin, which is too long to read, but anyway. And this is 1905, remember, and that's the Bulletin, which is the most famous quote about Arcadian Adelaide. So many thought the volume clever but unseemly, especially because the author was a woman. And the Bulletin reviewer saw it as a scurrilous and vicious attack on Adelaide society, which Mrs. Fisher, Thistle, by then had come to absolutely loathe. So the now notorious lady author made a lot of money from its editions, and she continued to go to society gatherings, especially the races, which she loved, and not just horse racing. Thistle later claimed to have made enough money to have purchased and maintained the first coursing hounds in Australia ever owned by a woman. That's greyhounds, as far as I know. Okay. So despite its critics, and there were many, from all over the country, Arcadian Adelaide was an absolute sensation. And in 1985, an historian, the late Derek Whitelock, rediscovered Thistle while doing some research into the city of Adelaide. He was writing a history. He was so fascinated that he organised a reprint with additional historical information about Adelaide in the early 1900s. That went out under Wakefield Press in 85, and Wakefield have since done another reprint in 2020, and I'm sure that's still available. So, what was all the fuss about? Well, Arcadian Adelaide was scathing, it was insulting, and in very many instances, accurate. Although not half as pointed and libellous as its sequel. She wrote another one a bit later, same year, called The Arcadians, and that was big stuff. But anyway, and she never got sued. I've never quite worked that out, particularly since she was in part attacking the judiciary. But anyway, and I think the Lord Chief Justice, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, but she describes people, their hair colour and the way. Anyway, for the most part, Thistle did not like South Australia, its people or its produce. She particularly despised the products of South Australia's fledgling wine industry, and here are a few of her comments. All the grapes on all the vines in all the vineyards of South Australia could not produce one glass of wine to equal the vin ordinaire of France. She was she spoke several languages. I'm not sure how many. The wine matches the inhabitants, and I leave the reader to supply his own adjectives. She was very, very, very clever. And then there were these. To pervert scripture slightly, we produce fruit, children and wine, but the greatest of these is wine. May a merciful God forgive Adelaide her wine if he cannot find it in his heart to forgive the poor fools who drink it. And that was just the beginning. Okay, so undeterred by the reception to her little book and possibly encouraged by the financial returns and the potential of more, Thistle rapidly published a sequel called The Arcadians. As I said, it was more scurrilous than the first, and it stopped just short of naming names, prominent businessmen, prominent solicitors, and here are a few, just go back a bit. Yes, right down there. Okay, all right. So one of the things, I'll go back to that, one of the things that she came down on very heavily was basically the way, sorry, I've lost my page here, that's why I'm not sure what's happened there. But anyway, she came down very, very heavily on the treatment of animals. She was an animal lover, even though she was into horse racing and greyhound racing and stuff. She saw that as perfectly okay. But yes. Yes, is that okay? Is that better? Okay, you're picking it up all right? Okay, good. Okay, so she came down very heavily in terms of the treatment of animals, particularly the horse trams. Now, she lived at Strams Hall in Hill Street at North Adelaide, and so the trams that were going up the hill were the ones she was particularly objecting to. She quite liked cab drivers, handsome cab drivers. That's handsome, not handsome, although she probably liked both. But anyway, so she had nice things to say about the handsome cab drivers, but she could afford to take handsome cabs. Most people couldn't. And often going up that hill towards O'Connell Street, people had to get out because the horses just couldn't manage. Imagine in summer, awful. Anyhow, so she came down very heavily in terms of the trams, but she came down most heavily in terms of the women. So she says, the misfortune, the women, they were in chapters, animals, produce, the women. The misfortune of the Adelaide women is that they were not born quadrupeds. They are a kind of mistake for cats and lack only the outward and visible signs of the feline tribe. To add even more venom, the writer went on to say that she was reminded of the old Spanish tradition that cats are descended from snakes, and this was followed by, the outward semblance of the Adelaide female is intense respectability, and of course in many cases, being homely to look upon, and exceedingly badly clothed, she has no temptation to err from the paths of strict propriety. The poorer type is terrible to look upon, and the rich women make one wonder how they manage to spend so much money in clothing their nakedness and with such disastrous results. But Thistle was nothing if not fair, and she went on to comment, still, there are a few younger specimens who are passing fair and, if rescued in time, might ornament a brighter sphere. But she reserved her most scathing shot for one Adelaide lady in particular, society columnist of the Critic, Lady Kitty, who was mentioned earlier. Now, Lady Kitty's real name was Mrs. Kathleen McCain, wife of the Critic's editor, Alfred McCain, and this is what she says about Lady Kitty. This appears under Part 2, The Inhabitants, Chapter 3, The Lesser Animals. I have not devoted much time to the classification of these, but I believe they comprise chiefly mosquitoes, cockroaches, flies, rats, and Lady Kitty. And that's all she says. Basically, Mrs. McCain and Thistle had been carrying on a long-running feud, possibly fuelled by Lady Kitty's disparaging remarks. You saw one earlier about Thistle's earlier career. Although it wasn't written under her name, she had connections everywhere. So about her early career as a Melbourne chorus girl and her acting ability, or her lack thereof. And it's true that in interviews Thistle greatly exaggerated her stage experience, claiming to have once starred in England. Oddly, she also claimed in a long 1905 Adelaide interview that she adored her beautiful, loving mother. That was Polly, whom she loathed. Polly, by the way, had remarried 2 years after George Anderson's death. That probably didn't help matters much. Anyway, undeterred, Thistle continued. Now we'll see where we get. We've mentioned the Arcadians, and what then happened was that Thistle had raised a lot of hackles, and she received more than one published response. This next one, sorry, those are the critiques. Our only comment on the book is that we are sorry for Miss Anderson. But then still Rudd liked her. Intensely feminine as the Arcadians, decidedly witty, made a big hit. However, the detractors. Now there's Mrs. Ellis, Mrs. F. Ellis. We don't find out her first initial of her own name. But anyway, this one was written by Mrs. Ellis, and it was titled A Scratch from an Adelaide Cat. So when you read it, the sarcastic prose of Mrs. Ellis is very heavy and stilted next to the lighter hand of her rival. Like Thistle's work, the booklet was priced at sixpence, and I have no idea how many copies were sold. Nowhere near as many as Arcadians or Arcadian Adelaide. Anyway, here's her response in verse to Thistle's criticisms of Adelaide's men as being celluloid-collared, narrow toe-booted, shallow-brained fools, and of course the cat's poor taste in clothing. And I'll just read you a little bit. How could you, oh Thistle, how could you write such a thing? How on poor Adelaide such disgrace could you bring? However could you these sad tears wring from us cats? How could you say what you do of our men and still be contented to wear one of them? Come, Thistle, dear, just solve this problem for us cats. And she goes on about it. And in the end, she says, in conclusion, dear Thistle, this is no place for you, and we'll tell you just the best thing you can do. Go back to heaven. We wish you adieu. Do we, cats? Wow. That's not in there. But anyway, okay, so this is Mr. F. Ellis. It's a signed photograph of a moustache-twirling, quite disgruntled-looking gentleman purporting to be Mrs. F. Ellis's husband, and it's signed, yours in disgrace, F. Ellis. And the Doxo hair remedy was on the following and final page. You used to get, if you were self-publishing, you would solicit, thank you, you would solicit advertising. Okay, so the signed image on the left is an insert from Arcadian Adelaide, the book that caused the fuss initially, and then she excited further social comment in Adelaide with the production of one of her own published short stories, which she had turned into a play, Berensky. An ad had appeared in the Courier and the Gummaraka Advertiser on the 19th of May 1905. So Seldom shy about singing her own praises, the ad, placed by Thistle, stated that the brilliant young author had written, adapted and produced the work. She also played the lead role. So they put on the play. The criticism was scathing, and the show was so bad. They put it on up at Mount Barker. The show was so bad that the director, female director, came out on stage at the end and apologised for the terrible performance. But it was okay. It wasn't anyone's fault. She blamed it all on the scenery. So, and one of the reviews said, May 23rd, Mount Barker. This is from The Observer, Adelaide. Last night in the Institute Hall, a drama entitled Berensky by Miss Thistle Anderson was staged. The performance and the authoress, who took the leading role, and her creation caused much amusement. The play lasted an hour only, and about half of that time was taken up by the changing of the scenery. So the director was correct. It was all the scenery's fault. Blame the scenery. Okay. Meanwhile, as Mrs. Herbert Fisher, the author and sometime actress, continued to enjoy the high life. This is her favourite hotel, the only one she deemed okay in Adelaide, and it was a South Australian. In fact, she deemed it passable. So here I'm just going to show you several images of the interior. It's rather gorgeous. And that was afternoon tea. If you look carefully, you'll see in the background there are some serving people, quite immaculate. All the tables are beautifully set, and there are cakes on them. If you get up close, you can just see the cakes. And okay, and there's one of the bedrooms. It's gorgeous. I don't know if that's a first-class room or not. So here's Thistle again in 1905 with her husband Herbert. This is 10th of June 1905, at the races again. They liked racing. She was reputed to have ridden a horse over the top of a cart at one stage. She was quite a daredevil. Anyway, some weeks after this image was taken came a scandalous court case related to Arcadia in Adelaide, but it wasn't a libel case. It was a very messy public court case in which Thistle sued the canvasser, the people who go around and get money for placing the adverts in the self-publishing books at that stage. So she sues her canvasser for defrauding her of £3, but in court, one of the revelations was that Herbert had left her. "My husband's gone off on me," was the quote used in court from a letter that she had very stupidly written to the canvasser, never put it in writing. Anyway, it said that she was flat broke, her husband had left her and she needed the £3 or else. And of course, when this came to court through Thistle's own work, basically, the ladies of the society ladies in Adelaide were absolutely triumphant. Their resultant glee over the trial's revelations probably contributed greatly to Thistle's rapid departure from Adelaide soon afterwards. So she reconciled. He actually did appear in court on her behalf. So she reconciled with Herbert. And this short piece in June 1905 announced the departure of Mrs. Herbert Fisher in November to fulfil engagements in London. No engagements in London. Note the quotation marks around starred again. Thistle, having reconciled with Herbert after the court case, did, however, leave with him for more glamorous and appreciative climes, never to reside here again, although she did once visit. Okay. So Thistle's short list of Adelaide's redeeming features in Arcadia in Adelaide, and it was a very short list, included the railway employees, the post office officials, cabmen, wheat, flour, fruit, and the weather. The weather in brackets, because it sometimes keeps the most disagreeable people indoors. And lastly, on that list of things she liked, a return ticket to Melbourne. She actually, I think, wanted a one-way ticket to Melbourne. This image was published in the Chronicle. Where are we? Soon after the departure on the 16th of December. In fact, they didn't go by train. They sailed from Adelaide to Melbourne. And then they went on to, they stayed in Melbourne for some months, went to America, loved San Francisco, stayed there a while, reputedly went back to Paris and then settled back in London. So while they're in Melbourne, this one, sorry, I'll go back. This is the Grand Hotel, which she rated very highly. Everything in Melbourne was better than anything in Adelaide. And she made that clear over and over again. I'm not going to say very much about that, except that they escaped and left Australia. Thistle she'd written a number of published works. The things she published here were only a small part of what she'd written, but the others were more serious and mainly written when she was younger and after she left Adelaide. There's a note there, note to be ready in August, Mark Morone, a novel. Nobody's found that novel. I think she was going to write it, but then with all the fuss, she just gave up on it. And so we've never seen a copy of it. But this, this is the cover of her 1908 book written in England, Dives' Wife, from the Bible, Dives. Thistle Anderson made much of her living as a writer, mainly as a poet, short story writer, and in Adelaide, of course, an acerbic social commentator. Later on, she became a journalist, mainly writing about horses and greyhounds, her first loves, and later still in Great Britain and France, she was a travel writer. She said in later interviews that she'd written about, or was going to write about, historic attractions like castles and chateaux. She didn't mention that while in England she'd also run a second-hand furniture business and had been had up in court again, accused of stealing goods from a female customer, in this case a suitcase. But I must stress that she wasn't convicted. So still in England, she really lived the high life in England. She was hanging out with all sorts of people. Countess de Manine, or Countess Manane, I think they called her in Australia. She really was a countess, really living the high life, very expensive, going shooting in Scotland for the grouse season or whatever it is they shot in Scotland during the hunting season. But they ran out of money. So this is 1912. Now, you'll see that it says, I've just read an announcement in an English paper of the death of Mrs. Herbert Fisher, known to the Adelaide world as Thistle Anderson, and it goes on about the books. This is the Daily Herald in the women's columns. In fact, it was not in 1912 Thistle who died. It was Herbert. They got it wrong. And he died in a hospital. Thistle was with him. She was at his bedside, according to Michael Stewart, who did a lot of the English research. But that little comment at the back, that nasty little comment, and again, it's the critic. Remember, there's a connection between Lady Kitty, Alfred McCain. Alfred McCain runs the critic. Thistle Anderson, to the death roll of old Adelaide change identities has to be added the name of Herbert Fisher, the husband of Thistle Anderson, whose demise occurred in London last month. His widow is enjoying life in Paris when last heard of. Well, no, she wasn't. They had a son also, a son called Dorian. And when Mr. Fisher, when Herbert died, he left his entire estate to his wife, but that consisted of just £10. However, there was an annuity to be paid for his son's upbringing. That was Dorian George, the son, and that may have come from a trust fund in Australia, but there is some doubt about whether that trust fund ever paid up, or at least whether it was maintained, because there is a story about when Thistle came back in the 30s. There's a recollection in a newspaper of her going to the stock exchange and basically breaking into the inner sanctum of the stock exchange, the offices, and chasing the head of the stock exchange down the street, screaming at him. She was a very large lady, very tall, and she chased him down the street screaming, "You stole my son's inheritance." So we don't know what happened. But yes, it was very messy, very unpleasant. So she did lots of things. She also, she came She came back to Australia, as I said, in the 1930s. She was here as a sports reporter, made some cutting comments about the miserly betting habits of Australian women, and then she returned to Europe and the UK. Interestingly, on the shipping record, she states that she is intending to become resident in Australia, but clearly that did not work out. So she didn't just come to South Australia, she went up to Queensland, didn't find anything to her liking, or maybe Australia didn't find her to their liking, who knows. But I get she did say some more complimentary things in newspapers here about, during interview, about how South Australia had changed for the better and the wine was passable and all that sort of stuff. After leaving now, she was writing as Mrs. Clavering Anderson at this stage, and sometimes Mrs. Shermer Clavering Anderson, sometimes just Mrs. Shermer, or any combination of those. So what had happened is that after leaving Australia, as I said, she'd continued to write under various names. She possibly also wrote as a sports journalist under Thistle Anderson, because obviously she was a female in a man's world. So I haven't found anything of her writing under that name. But anyway, in the 30s, she also wrote as Mrs. George Shermer, or Shermer with an A. So this was because after Herbert's death, Thistle had remarried, but not well. Her new husband was George Shermer, some years her junior. She met him in 1915, sailing to America. She put her age down. She was always doing something with her age, up, down, up, down. She put her age down. He put his age up when they got married. And according to his wife in court later, he was a very nasty piece of work. Domestic violence and cheating, although she was doing her fair share, because in those days you had to have grounds for divorce. She'd been trying to divorce him for decades and went to court. There was 3 court appearances. The first one, neither of them turned up. The second one, she had to sleep with somebody else whom she later lived with, and admitted in court to get a divorce. That didn't happen. And so finally she got the divorce, I think in 36 or thereabouts. Took a long time. But anyway, both of them had other relationships during that period. So almost to the end, this is England during World War II, and it's very close to where Thistle then lived. She moved around a lot, and it's also where she died. So the multiple name changes made her quite difficult to track, but eventually I located her death certificate under Thistle Mary Clavering Shermer, and that is a very brief news report. Lawrence Street lady's fatal collapse. At midday on Saturday, Mrs. Thistle Clavering Shermer, 60, she was 64 or 5, of 14 Lawrence Street, Chelsea, collapsed and died in the private bar of the Feeney Arms. I think it's pronounced Feeney, but I'm not sure. Apologies if that's incorrect. And that's her death certificate. And that's the Feeney Arms. So, was Thistle Anderson shameless? Was she scandalous? Absolutely. She made a career out of shocking society. The papers were filled with her exploits, from her early years with Williamsons through her marriage to Herbert Fisher and the later separations and the love affairs, and it went on and on and on, and the court appearances. For South Australians, that shameless career focused mainly on Arcadia and Adelaide and the lesser-known sequel, The Arcadians. Many Adelaideans were equally fascinated by the court case and the Fishers' rapid departure from what Thistle had dubbed the Holy Village, and that was not a compliment. So Thistle's rag to riches story and then back riches to rags would have made a great romantic blockbuster. Her friends and supporters saw her, and she did have some, many, they saw her as rebellious, brave, passionate, clever, and a skillful writer. Her detractors, particularly in Adelaide, saw her as willful, reckless, spiteful and careless. She was undeniably larger than life, and in quaint Arcadian Adelaide, even after her departure, she was certainly remembered for several decades. And one last thing, I said there was a secret that she'd kept, which even the most inquisitive and nastiest of her opponents never found out about. If they had, particularly Lady Kitty and co, it would have been just one scandal too many, and she would have been ruined. And I'll get to it in just a second. Okay, these are the reprints, the Wakefield imprints, and this is the secret. Okay, so what we're looking at is a marriage certificate. I'll give you a close-up in a moment. So it's a marriage certificate between Thistle, not Mary C. or Mary Clavering, but Thistle Anderson in 1898. Remember, she married Herbert in 1901? 1898, and remember I said she went to Sydney and Sydney was important. So Eckenstein had died. She was claiming a close relationship, which is, I don't know. She falls in with a man called Lionel Lippmann van Praag. And he's about 16 or 20, I think he's about 46 or 30. Anyway, he's older than she is, by quite some time. She is, I think, not quite 20. And on the certificate, she says that she is 21. Now, that's important because, and she's at Holt's marriage agency in Melbourne. I should have told you that. And it's witnessed by two people. They often had professional witnesses in the civil courts. So, well, it was a church ceremony, but it's complicated. But anyway, so by law, she has to be 21 in order to marry. If she is not 21, she has to get legal permission from her parent or guardian. Now, her father has been dead several years by now, but her mother is still alive, and we all know by now about her relationship with Polly. So she didn't have the permission, and that's possibly the point at which she legally changes her name. And after that, she's always Thistle Anderson, not Mary Clavering or Mary C. And secondly, the groom, Lionel Lippmann van Praag. As I said, he's a lot older. He listed his marital status on this document, and it's a legal document, remember. It's a binding marriage certificate between two people in 1898 in Victoria. He lists his marital status as widowed. He's a liar. He was a constant liar. I mean, I've tracked him all the way almost to America, to America and the Mexican Revolution. But anyway, he was a con man. He was a liar. He was a serial cheat. But anyway, here he is marrying this young woman that he's found. He was possibly a stage door Johnny or something like that. But he's picked up Thistle. She's grieving, we think, and they get married. So he's widowed. He's a liar. His wife, Sabina, was alive and living in New South Wales at the time of the Victorian marriage. Now, Thistle stated in court many decades later that she had, when she's trying to get divorced from Sherma, that she had undergone, quote, a form of marriage with Lionel van Praag, end quote. And then that she was told 5 months later about the other very living Mrs. van Praag, and so she promptly left him. He then absconded so there wouldn't be any kind of court case or scandal, and she got on with her life, telling absolutely no one. So the marriage was, in fact, although it was legal and binding, it wasn't, because she was underage, and I don't know a lot about the law, but bigamy is bigamy. She finally obtained an annulment in 1915 when she caught up with Van Praag in the USA. That's the trip where she met the next husband, George Sherma, on board a ship, I think. And it was a very tightly held secret, kept hidden even from Herbert Fisher. However, turns out when the will was published, Herbert Fisher's will, he did know about it, and he wrote in his will that he was aware of his wife's former marriage. So there you go. Wouldn't Lady Kitty have eaten that up? Thank you for your attendance, folks. I'm here for questions. Okay.